Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a deeply complex, incredibly tragic event, the 1998 Cavalese cable car disaster. What started as a highly localized tragedy in the breathtaking Italian Alps escalated so fast, it literally blew the lid off massive systemic military failures and pushed geopolitical alliances right to their breaking point. We're going to really get into the human errors, the serious chain of command breakdowns, and the intense diplomatic fallout that follow. But before we get into the exact mechanics of what went wrong, we've got to ground ourselves in the sheer, unimaginable devastation of this event. 20. That's the number of civilians, vacationers from all over Europe, families just out enjoying a ski holiday, who were killed in an absolute instant. A tragedy of this massive magnitude demands that we ask, how on earth could something like this happen, and why?
Okay, let's dive into this and trace the really rapid, catastrophic sequence of events on February 3, 1998. So, at 14:36 local time, a U.S. Marine Corps EA-6B Prowler jet takes off from a Viano Air Base in Italy for a low-altitude training mission. Flash forward to 15:06, and air traffic control completely loses radio contact with the jet as it's maneuvering through these narrow, plunging alpine valleys. Just 4 minutes later, at 15:10, a cable car packed with skiers starts its descent from the summit station. And then, just 2 minutes after that, at 15:12, the jet, ripping through the valley at an astonishing 540 miles per hour, slices right through the gondola support cable. The cabin plummets 300 feet to the ground. Now, the crew managed to land their damaged plane safely a few minutes later, but the devastation, it was already complete.
Moving into Part 1, the missing tape, survivor's guilt, and destroyed evidence.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that to truly grasp the aftermath, we have to look inside the cockpit at the visceral, psychological toll, specifically focusing on the navigator, Captain Joseph Schweitzer. The profound internal conflict he faced is just devastating. He actually stated later, "I'm going to see my smiling face next to the blood and stuff for the rest of my life." See, Schweitzer was on what was supposed to be his last deployment, and he had borrowed a video camera, bringing it into the cockpit to capture some memories. As the horrifying reality of those 20 deaths actually set in, he was hit with agonizing survivor guilt. He suddenly remembered that just before the disaster, he had turned the camera on himself and smiled. He was absolutely terrified of how that footage would look to the world and what it would do to him personally if it ever got out.
Driven by sheer panic and this overwhelming guilt, Schweitzer actually called the tape the physical manifestation of his survivor's guilt. And the steps he took next, they completely derailed the entire investigation. First off, when the plane landed back at base, he immediately swapped the recorded tape with a blank one, just leaving that blank cassette right there in the cockpit camera for investigators to find. Step 2, he hid the real, recorded tape in his personal quarters while the initial shock of the whole crash set in. And finally, Step 3, a few days later, after confiding in another crew member, he walked out and tossed the recorded tape straight into a bonfire. This deliberate destruction of evidence didn't just severely impact the military investigation by removing the only objective visual record of the flight, it fundamentally altered the public's entire perception of the crew's honesty.
All right, let's look at Part 2, conflicting rules and training gaps, and a major chain of command breakdown.
And this brilliantly illustrates how, when we zoom out from the individual crew members, we start seeing these massive institutional failures that compromised the mission before the jet even left the runway. U.S. military command actually provided the crew with obsolete maps from 1986. Think about that. These maps had absolutely no ski resorts marked on them, and the crew was briefed on a 1,000-foot minimum altitude limit. But the Italian reality? Completely different. The terrain was heavily developed with modern gondolas, and the Italian government had actually implemented a new 2,000-foot altitude restriction. The chain of command completely failed to communicate these absolutely vital safety regulations to the pilots navigating that airspace.
And we have to consider their recent experience, too. The squadron, including the navigator who was responsible for plotting the route, had been hyper-focused on high-altitude support missions over Bosnia. Because of that, the navigators severely lacked recent practical practice plotting low-level maneuvers in complex alpine environments. So you combine that specific training gap with a commander failing to brief the crew on the new 2,000-foot Italian altitude limits, and you basically have a recipe for disaster. On top of all that, investigators found that the crew experienced a false horizon optical illusion. Flying over a gradual incline in the fading afternoon light at over 500 miles per hour, the visual cues in the valley literally tricked them into believing they were flying much higher than they actually were. Their altimeter readings simply couldn't keep up with the rapidly changing terrain.
Which brings us to Part 3, SOFA and strained diplomacy, the geopolitical fallout.
This localized tragedy quickly ignited an immense diplomatic crisis, throwing international treaties and national sovereignty right into the spotlight. To understand exactly why, we have to talk about the Status of Forces Agreement, or SOFA. Basically, this is a 1954 treaty that establishes the rights of foreign military personnel in a host country. Crucially, it grants the U.S. primary criminal jurisdiction over its troops if they are acting in the line of duty. So, because the pilots were on an official training mission, this very specific legal framework completely prevented Italy from prosecuting the American pilots in their own Italian civilian courts, even though the incident happened right there on their own sovereign soil. You can absolutely imagine the reaction on the ground. The Italian public, the media, local officials, they were deeply outraged. They quickly dubbed the event Strage del Cermis, or the Massacre of Cermis. There were widespread, passionate protests across the country, entirely fueled by what was perceived as American military impunity and a total lack of local accountability. Citizens really felt that foreign troops were operating with a reckless disregard for civilian life. This intense anger severely strained the critical NATO alliance during a really volatile time in Europe. The pressure mounted so fast that it actually forced unprecedented public apologies from top U.S. officials, including President Bill Clinton, as they scrabbled to try and manage the cascading diplomatic fallout.
So the crucial point is that ultimately the military hierarchy controlled the investigation's outcome, and the results sent shockwaves through Europe. Under U.S. military jurisdiction, the pilot and navigator were tried in North Carolina. In March 1999, they were acquitted of involuntary manslaughter, meaning they were not held criminally responsible for the 20 deaths because the military jury found no criminal intent. However, because of that missing tape we talked about, they were both found guilty of obstruction of justice and conduct unbecoming an officer for the cover-up. Both men were dismissed from the service, but that manslaughter acquittal, it left a deep, unhealed wound in Italy.
On the financial side of things, the U.S. government ultimately paid out approximately $20 million in compensation to the victims' families. But here's the thing. While millions were paid, it was all done without the U.S. formally admitting any legal liability. For a lot of the families in the Italian public, this financial compensation just felt hollow. It left many feeling entirely robbed of true institutional accountability, leaving them with the belief that military hierarchies were just protecting their own rather than facing up to systemic failures.
As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a profoundly complex question to think about. When a superpower's military operates within sovereign allied nations, is true accountability ever really possible? How do we balance necessary military training and international alliances with the absolute right to safety and justice for local civilians? It's a question that echoes long after the tragedy of Cavalese, and one that is for sure continuing to shape international relations today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it gave you a clear and structured perspective on this pivotal historical event.